Hi, everybody, and welcome back to yet another cracking installment of the Matt Brown Show. This is the Secrets of Scale series, where I'm connecting you to founders who have built things to scale. With me on the line is the co-founder and CEO of Champ Titles. Interesting brand name, but his name is Shane Bigelow. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Matt.
Shane, great to have you here, man. So listen, why don't you kick us off and just paint a picture for our audience of who are your customers, what are you in the business of, and the problem that you're solving.
Yeah, absolutely. So, since you brought up the brand, I'll share what it is. So, um, you know, the champ in boxing holds the title, so it's a little bit of a play on words there. But most people know us as just champ. So the company builds technology for government to replace their aging title and registration systems. So anybody that's ever waited in line at the DMV or had to deal with their motor vehicle department is probably familiar with the pain of that transaction. And we set out to try to solve it, but we took it from a different approach. We said, well, what do the users actually need? What do the consumers need? The car dealers, the insurance carriers, the fleet operators, what do they need? And if they can get that from their state government, then we'll be able to have a lot of transactions. And that's the way we get paid, is through the transactions.
Very interesting. So what's the backstory to this? Because it's quite a different problem that you guys are solving. How did you land up with the business that you have?
Yeah, so my first startup, at this stage, more years ago than I care to remember, or care to admit, I suppose. I like remembering them, but was in automotive lending. And when you understand automotive lending, one thing that lenders have to do is apply liens to a title. And back then, I recognized that there was a problem with titling. My co-founder was a very large car dealer, and he's not operating the business. He was chairman of our board, but he understood it from the retail perspective of all the pain and the angst that consumers go through. And as we spent time trying to figure out how to solve this problem together, we realized that we could help government and at the same time help the constituents if we really solved this issue of why is the titling process in all 50 states so slow and so cumbersome. And there hadn't been new technology in the space for the better part of 2 decades. Unfortunately, a lot of motor vehicle departments, didn't have the budget to make the changes they needed to make. And so they were stuck with some older technologies. In fact, many times the mainframes we see are 40, 50, or 60 years old. So from a business opportunity, this looked like a place that was ripe for change. And we decided to go after it together.
So let's talk about this. So I'm curious. I'm getting Peter Newell on the show. He's a former Navy SEAL. He was basically in charge of the U.S. military's on-the-ground innovation program. So, I mean, it was ridiculous amounts of money that he was putting into innovation in the military. And he's coming back onto the show. He's been on my show, well, it'll be the second time. But I'm curious to ask you about the government, because I was chatting to a founder yesterday, and we were talking about AI and ChatGPT and this kind of stuff, and we were curious about how innovative is the public sector really? If you talk about the government specifically, when it comes to the adoption of these tools. I mean, clearly you guys you've scaled, you've raised roughly 30 million so far. It's not a small amount of money compared to most, but you've gone into the government to help them innovate. Do you know what I mean? So
Sure.
Curious to ask you, you're at the coalface of it, how is the government or the public sector actually innovating when it comes to technology?
Yeah, what I've observed is the vast majority of employees at the government or elected officials do genuinely want to help their constituents. Unfortunately, their hands are often tied by either very complex procurement rules or contracts that are difficult to break or get out of. And what you really needed was a a combination of things to occur for government to be able to accept that there were other technologies that could help them. The first thing you needed was that people had to start consuming a lot more on their phone. And as that happened, what you observed was that just individuals became used to this idea of SaaS, right? Software as a service became a thing. And we consumed it, whether it was from an app or whether it was from a subscription service of some sort, but we got used to it. But it never really entered a lot of the government space. It started, oddly enough, in hunting and fishing licenses and camping licenses and marriage licenses, where you could go online and finally apply for one of those. But it never made it into the DMV until the last couple of years. And as it did, what DMVs realized, and by the way, unfortunately for DMVs, most of them are on the list of one of the top 10 things that every governor in the country wants to fix in their state, because it's a pain point for citizens. They started to say, well, how can I fix this, even though I've got all these other problems like identity and licensing and roads and bridges and infrastructure that I need to spend time on? How can I fix this thing that actually causes people to be in line and perhaps have a bigger problem with moving around their second largest asset, which is their car? And insert us, what we found was that they're very receptive to the idea of saying, okay, you've done it over here with hunting, fishing, and other things. You've started to do it in things like your driver's license and identity. Now let's take this document, whether it's title, a registration, or a lien, and let's move it into the digital world using a SaaS service. And that was new, right? That's not something that they've seen before, been able to consume before. It was always that they had to buy a really big on-prem, non-cloud-based, heavy keystroke system. If you've ever walked up to a DMV clerk, it's a lot like going to the counter at the airport where you say, my name's Shane Bigelow, and they type for what feels like 6 minutes. And you're like, there's not that many letters. What were you possibly typing? But it's because of the way they have to interact with their system that it causes the pace to go very slowly. It's the same thing at the DMV when they're dealing with this old technology. Insert something new, and all of a sudden the advancement can reach the masses very quickly. And we've seen that in one of our first states, where they've gone from processing in 40 days down to 0 days. It's almost a real-time processing at this stage. So what I've observed is that government wants to help. They just needed a moment where there was a business model that would enable them to focus on the projects that required their attention, and then not focus on the things that could be fixed through technology. And that moment just happened to be in the last few years.
Okay. So you scaled both, you've scaled a startup in the private sector and now with champ titles in the public sector. How is it different, or is there a degree of added difficulty when it comes to scaling a startup when you look at your experience in the private versus the public sector? Is there a difference, or do you feel like, dude, it doesn't matter? Or do you feel that when you're successful at selling into the government, your ticket sizes are higher, because the money's all there effectively? What's your experience been?
Yeah, scaling is always hard. I'd love to find the person that says it's easy, and maybe I could learn something from them. So I think it's been hard. It's hard in both sectors, but the reality of government is a little more akin to what you said there at the end. Once you get the contract, right, it grows pretty quickly because the users are there, right? We all have to consume government services. So the key is finding a way for the government to be able to deliver this service back to their constituents and have it resonate and actually have it solve a real problem, right? We took it from the perspective of a lender needing liens to prove that they had a stake in an asset. And sometimes that would take far too long, and something would happen to the asset in between the time when they wanted to have the lien and when they actually got it. Similarly, car dealers, they'll buy and sell cars. And when they buy a car from someone, if they have to wait 3, 4, 6, sometimes 8 weeks to get a title so they can sell the car, that's dead inventory and it's very expensive. So by trying to solve those problems, What we've observed is that you can scale a lot faster in government, because if you're solving the constituent problems, the government will give you an opportunity to try to help them. In the private sector, I think there's probably an argument that some B2C businesses could scale even faster. But in the B2B world, I do think a lot of companies are skeptical of doing business with startups, right? I think everybody likes to talk about it, but very few entities actually want to do it. At the end of the day, most people go to work and they don't want to lose their job. And so how do you not lose your job? You don't take a risk. And in government, if you're solving the constituent problem, that is their risk. Their risk is that the constituents continue to have the problem tomorrow. So anyone that can solve it, provided that they can meet a certain standard of quality of vendor and have the right partners. We do this with partners. We're not doing this alone. We've got some really big, great partners that help us with things in government. And that's a key too, is that you have to know what you can do well and what you can't. And partners are key to this. So I think I feel like it's a bit of a rambling answer to your question, but I think government actually can scale faster in many cases than the private sector, particularly versus B2B. I do see that B2C potentially has a lot more opportunity to scale. And you just look at, social media and other things that can scale a lot faster in the B2C world.
Yeah. So just on that, it's quite interesting, right? In that in America, if you're in a B2C space, you're actually quite privileged because you have this massive consumer market. There's 350, 400 million people that you can scale to overnight, assuming you have the capital to do that. In Africa, you don't have that massive consumer market. Like in South Africa, there's, say, 45, 50 million consumers. So if you were a B2B business, what you would do to get 10 million customers overnight is that you would go B to B to C. And if you were in the financial services space, for example, you would go to the bank and you would say, hey, Mr. Standard Bank, excuse me, or whoever the financial services company is, we've developed this mobile payment solution. This is an actual example. SnapScan was the company. And then what they did was to get access to 10 million customers overnight, quote unquote, they would sell to the intermediary to get access to the consumer base. What's interesting from an observational perspective from my side, Shane, is that you're actually in a B to G to C. It's weird, right? So like I've never actually come up with that. It was B to G is business to government to consumer. And to your point, I would say that if you wanted to get access to literally the entire country with one strategic partner being the government. For instance, if you took, I know there's states here, let's just take New York, whatever the case is. But if you wanted to, scale your solution, your platform, or title management or what have you, to all the drivers in New York, then the government is your partner. You know what I mean? And it's a very, very powerful idea in a developed and mature market like the US.
You're exactly right. And the way that we've thought through this is that if you solve the problems that consumer is having, whether that consumer happens to be a car dealer, a human that's just trying to move their own personal vehicles around, or an insurance carrier, or a fleet operator, however you want to define person, if you solve that person's issue, then they will consume the service that's made available to them through government. And you wind up with a much wider, subset of users. I mean, I'm always amazed. We have these big screens in our office, and I see them and I watch the transactions, and it's kind of amazing to see how quickly it grows and how many new users are coming through and touching it and creating a transaction. And you're right, the government is the conduit, and I truly believe that so many companies have looked at the government and said, that's my customer. And that's where they stopped. And they stopped because the government has so much money to give out because they tax people and that's how they get their money. We didn't want to take that approach. We didn't want to just like suck the air out of the government and make it our air. That didn't seem like we were doing anything good for society if we did that. Instead, we said, well, what's the consumer problem? Let's route it through the government and we'll solve the consumer problem. The government will be happy. and everyone will pay less in fees than they would have paid as taxpayers had they had to buy a big system in the government to solve this problem in a different way.
And on that bombshell, we're going to take a quick break. The Matt Brown Show is presented by Carafin, an investment bank that offers and supports direct private investments in U.S. operating companies. Over the past 20 years, investors have placed over $1.2 billion of private debt and equity in more than 100 companies through Carafin and its affiliates. Carafin leverages technology to empower its community of investors to deploy their capital far more efficiently than ever before and connects their community of engaged investors with worthy companies. Invest portions of your portfolio in direct private investments today. Visit carafin.com/Matt Brown Show for more. Shane, I have a question now because you got me curious. So the government is not a small buyer of what you do. And to your point, they have all these users, right? So when you do a deal with the government, my sense would be is that you could be put into a situation where you need to scale quickly, which means you need to scale potentially infrastructure, maybe your back office operations and things like that. Has that been the case for you? And what have you learned about scaling operations and infrastructure when you're dealing with a massive client or customer like the government?
Well, so it has and has not been the case for us, and I'll explain what I mean. We've deployed a lot of technology to solve problems that historically have been solved by humans. And the logic was there's only so many people that can be hired into government before it's more of a drain on all of us as taxpayers. So if we can give the people that are currently in government better tools by deploying more technology, then they can get to the tasks that are actually much more in need of a heavy touch from them. And so by deploying a lot of technology, we didn't actually need to grow our back office in some way to just be a business process outsource company, right? And then I think that's kind of been one of the models that of company that's gone after government is to say, well, we'll do it for you. Well, okay, but where's the efficiency in that? It's just taking humans from one place and moving them to another. Let's make the humans that are there more efficient. And so by doing that, our technology does enable a lot of things to occur without massive additions of human or headcount on our side, which is sort of classic software model, right? You shouldn't need that many humans if your software works really well. But there are things that we don't do. And I firmly believe that we don't have a corner on genius, wake up every day trying to learn from great companies that are around us. And by finding really great partners in different sectors and either within government or outside of government that has to work with these constituents and leveraging them for what they're good at, it's also helped us not have to grow the headcount in the same way if we tried to vertically handle all of that ourselves. So, I spent some time at a company I love called Cisco Systems. And I've never seen a place that did a better job of really truly partnering with the different channels that got their products into the market. And I'd like to think that, at this stage, almost 20 years later, I still take that as part of my DNA because we're trying to bring that forward in our company to say there are great partners that do things that are better than what we do. Let's partner with them and leverage them. So I think scale is also not just what your headcount looks like, but how are you leveraging the great things that are around you and admitting that there are entities that do things better than you.
Exactly. And I think what you're touching on, another way to re-articulate what you said from my experience is it's this idea that, look, you're a SaaS company. Let's just say that your ticket size over the course of a year is, $10,000 for the purposes of illustration. What you're saying is, especially in the governmental space, like they don't just want to buy that one SaaS product. There's other things that go along with the implementation of that. There are processes that it impacts. There are quantifiable costs and unquantifiable costs of implementing this thing. And so and now suddenly it's like, well, hang on, but you only do this one thing, but it affects this thing like training, but you don't do training. So then what you're saying is as you go from essentially a product sell to a solution sell. So you bring in 3 partners or 2 partners, or in this example, 1 partner to do the training. Maybe there is a data mapping, solution provider that you bring in, or strategic partner that you bring in. And so together you take your ticket from, let's just say, $10,000 to $50,000. But together, the value of that solution sell is more valuable to the buyer than it is just buying your $10,000 SaaS product.
It's a fair way to think about it, with one caveat. We look at the current partners that are already inside of government and try to partner with them to say, can we leverage you a different way? So that way, instead of going from 10,000 to 50,000, those companies are already getting paid. They're already a line item in the government's budget. So we're trying to make use of them more efficient, and they might make a little bit more if the tasks at hand expand, but we wouldn't want the scale to be, 10 to 5x 10. That wouldn't necessarily be fair. There's another way that we've tried to do this, and I think this is starting to resonate in the market. I hope that anyone that's listening realizes this. There are players in the private sector that want to connect into government, and they want to be able to use government services to sell the value-added services they sell. So part of our challenge was, when we were building technology, do we go out and compete with all of those entities that are having value-added services on top of government, or do we just make their businesses more efficient because now they can do things digitally and they don't have to run paper with couriers, and they don't have to worry about errors because our AI is checking things, or whatever the case might be. And so that became our concept. And frankly, I think some of those folks probably sometimes think that we're competing with them, but we're really just trying to make them better, because our view is that's another way to scale, right? They have all of these customers they've had for eons. They've got relationships and contracts together. Why would we try to go take those if we can simply get them to use the government services better? They will sell in air quotes our product for us, because they'll say, hey, we have a better way to process this title, this registration, this lien for you. And they're the service providers to many companies out there. And so we love the service provider community because they sit on top of the government. What I say is it's a battle of prepositions. We build technology for government. They build technology that connects to government. So if the connection to government is better because of what we've built, their businesses will make more money and their consumers will be happier, and will scale without having to go get those consumers all on our own, because they'll go do that because it's good for their business.
Mm. Yeah, it's a very interesting thing, and I see it more and more, this idea of scaling through strategic partnerships. And there's this old doctrine, right? It's like, well, you find product market fit, you must know your unit economics, and you must get to a point where you put $1 in and get $3 out, and then and only then do you go and raise your Series A, so then you can put more engine or fuel rather into the rocket ship, so that you can, scale and make more money. But I've seen it not only in the context of what we've discussed so far, Shane, but I've also seen it in the context of funding. So I know a lot of founders who've tried the VC route, and who, for whatever reason, obviously VCs don't always get it right, but they, for whatever reason, they found the cost of capital is too high at the moment given where the market's at. Or maybe it's just harder than normal given where the market's at. And so what they've done is they've looked at strategic partners to help them fund. So they will take 10 million from a strategic partner. To your point, imagine there's, a provider that connects to, I'm saying, like that example, and they funded your growth. Like you became not only strategic partners, but equity partners too.
Well, you're hitting on exactly what we've done. Some of our funding has come from exactly those partners. So In your first example of that sort of classic model of, dollar in, show me your cost of goods sold, show me the return, I'll give you more money later. I remember sitting in college and having a professor tell me this, and I sort of argued against it and said, well, couldn't you just partner with a bunch of folks and get there faster? And they're like, no, it doesn't work that way. And I said, well, but what about this example and that example? Yeah, but those are unicorns. It'll never happen. It's like, no, it's happening all over the place, but it's not making its way into a textbook. And I think a lot of businesses are looking at this and saying, let's stop with the ego and the hubris that we can be, vertically integrated and do everything for you, right? We probably can't. So why face that battle? Let's partner with the best in class out there. And many times when they see that that's your genuine attitude, that you're not trying to steal their cheese, then they're happy to invest in you. It takes some convincing. It's a cultural shift, I think, for some of those strategic partners too, because they're not necessarily accustomed to someone coming in and genuinely trying to help. But I worked for a great CEO years ago, and he used to say, the world would be so much better if everyone just presumed positive intent. So PPI, just presume positive intent. And that's what it takes with strategic partners, is you have to convince them, just presume I'm not here I'm not an axe murderer. I'm not here to kill you. Just let me in. I'm going to try to be helpful. And if I'm not, you can just turn this off, right? And it's not going to cost you anything. Your investors made a decision, and like you said, not all VC investments work out. But hopefully, this one does.
Well, you mentioned Cisco, right? So my previous company was a media business that did, pipeline generation for tech brands. So we worked right across Africa and the Middle East for, everybody, Cisco, Microsoft, SAP, you name them. And let's be frank, if you know that space, the whole ecosystem there for these mature behemoth companies like Microsoft is based off partnerships.
Partnerships, yeah.
That's it. So like if it's working for the most valuable companies in the world, why wouldn't it work for you? And to your point, I think people are distrusting, right? Because there's this idea that there's not enough to go around, But I think sometimes the best part, we're also not saying, by the way, that you need to have 10 of these things. You need one good one, and it can change everything when it comes to scale.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I often find that textbooks are about 40 years behind, right? They're analyzing what happened as opposed to what is happening. And, you look at Microsoft and Cisco and, to some extent, IBM was at the forefront of this, and maybe they've gotten a little bit away from it, but the newer tech companies have sort of taken it over. And I see certainly in the venture-backed communities, so the Series A, B, C type of companies, where I think they're figuring this out, right? It keeps expenses lower, right? My investors are hopefully happier that we don't burn capital at the same rate as somebody who's trying to do everything vertically. Are you going to dominate the world? Maybe, but maybe not. But everyone will, do really well, and isn't that the point? And so I think if we just, for us, our culture is just stay focused on doing what we do well, find partners for everything else, pick the gold standard partner. And if they really like you, they'll invest in you and support you.
The other thing to say is that I think a lot of startups seem to think that strategic partnerships happen later, so it's like you get, startup phase, growth phase, mature phase, and expansion, say. So when you are at this mature stage, it's kind of like, well, you kind of dominated the market appetite for what you're selling potentially. And so what typically happens, you get into a Series B round, and so you start to acquire companies like Salesforce acquiring Slack. They acquired a whole bunch of companies and then completely blew the integration of it. Like I was talking to one of the account directors, and she's like, if I wanted to set up someone for a Slack license, I don't even know who to talk to at Salesforce.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And so it's one idea, which is to grow through acquisition. And again, depending on how old the company is, and PE starts playing a role, less so VC. But then it's like, well, what strategic partnerships do you have in place? You know what I mean? So that you can start to diversify into other industries where you potentially didn't have much traction.
the visual that I think of is when if you were back in the gold rush period and you were sort of putting all the dirt in your sifter and you're shaking it and you're trying to get all the dirt to come through and the gold to be on top. That's what I feel like when we go to find strategic partners, because a lot of people would tell us early on, oh, that company's not going to want to talk to you. And it was like, maybe not. Let's shake the shifter and see what would happen. And oftentimes what you find is that these larger companies are desperate for some sort of innovation, and they maybe can't get it internally or can't get it as quickly internally because they've got so many other projects to worry about. But as you're sifting through all these big companies, what you'll find is a few gold rocks, kind of surface to the top. And those are the companies that want to innovate, but realize they may not be able to do it internally, that are willing to listen to your story and genuinely work together to try to solve problems. And I think all they really want in return is some level of patience from you as a startup that, hey, you're not going to move as fast as I want you to move, right? That it's gonna cost a little bit more. It's going to take a little bit more time. But the payout is there. It's a lot like government. You wind up with a lot more users if your partner already has all the customers and you just have to tie into them. So that's the analogy of whenever I went out or try to go out now, even for partners or investment partners, it's, you don't always take the highest valuation or the sexiest brand. What you take is the one that can help you the most. And I think we've done that, and hopefully I'm right.
Well, so far so good, right? I think the other thing, speaking of analogies, so it's like strategic partners are like looking for a car parking spot, but not any car parking spot, the one right outside the front door, right? Because here's the thing, I don't know how you found this, Shane, but when you go to a busy shopping center and you're looking for a car parking space, how often do you look where there's one open right outside the front? Many of us don't do that. We go look at the back or where we feel like, oh, there's going to be a space there, or, because, everything by the front door is taken. So and I do it deliberately. It pisses my wife off to no end. But I'll literally drive there and I'll look for the one right outside the front. Because if you don't look, you don't get. And it's the same thing with strategic partnerships.
Yeah, I have three sons, and this is how I taught them the meaning of the words pole position, because I refer to that first spot as, oh, we got the pole position. They're like, what did we get? Like, the pole position. We got the front best spot. And I'm exactly with you. I go for that spot every time. And I also think it's, the presumed positive intent. It's also the power of positive thinking. I'm always amazed that I only find those spots on days when I'm in a good mood and I'm positive. On days when I might be feeling negative, I never find that spot. So I might as well just be happy and hope for the best. And maybe you're sticking your head in the sand sometimes, but I still like getting that first spot. So I'll take it, even with a sandy head.
Like an ostrich.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
All right, guys, we'll take a quick break. Scale your business with your own AI-powered digital marketing assistant. Sign up today and get $250 of your first month's ad spend back. Check out meetotis.com/rapid returns for more. Raising money for your startup? Well, why don't you close your next funding round fast? Get investor-focused media and FaceTime with relevant investors in days. Visit showworksmedia.com for more. That's showworks with an X, media.com. Shane, when it comes to scale, what are you struggling with right now? What's on your mind?
It's funny. I regularly feel like our vision is pretty similar to, the days or weeks before we actually hit go on the company 5 years ago. But I regularly hear, well, we're trying this, we're trying that. We don't have as much focus. Maybe it's the size of the aperture of the lens, because I feel like the focus is still there. But I think as the team gets bigger, I've started to realize that you start a company with a handful of people that have a very wide aperture. And as you hire more people, they're very good at their specific roles. And you actually need to narrow the aperture for them to have the highest probability of success. So getting better at trying to help them with a more narrow aperture and not having them feel like all the different things that we're trying or attempting to get better at are a distraction, because I can see the view of why we need to do a lot of different things, but we also want to stay focused. And it's a lot like the hedgehog principle from Jim Collins' Good to Great book. You sort of need that hedgehog principle in order to achieve some level of success. But I also think about the founder of Netflix and his book, and how he talked about how they tried a lot of different things before they figured out that mailing DVDs would eventually convert to streaming and production company. And so, you can't argue that they didn't change the world and become a great company. What you can argue is, well, there's some balance between hedgehog principle and, achieving success. And I think that's the tough part about scaling any operation, is that you have to recognize, or I think you have to recognize, that the teams you hire sometimes need you to narrow that aperture for them so that they can have the highest probability of succeeding in their role. And if you don't do that, you're actually doing your team a disservice. So we're trying to get better at that. And, hopefully if anybody on the team is listening, they know that we're trying.
So you're going to have to explain this hedgehog principle.
Sure. So I'll try to do the book justice, but this book, Good to Great, identified a handful of companies that wildly outperformed their peers over 15-year periods. And one of the core things that they identified was that these companies defined their hedgehog principle. So the hedgehog, an animal that, I'm not sure if people have figured out exactly how old it is, but it looks prehistoric. If you ever seen a hedgehog, and they kind of march along doing their thing. And unlike a fox that sort of tries to outfox the predators that are coming after it, but might one day put itself in a risky situation, the hedgehog has the exact same plan every day for predators. It goes along its efforts and then balls up whenever a predator is close and just waits it out. And that hedgehog principle keeps the hedgehog alive, and as it lasts since prehistoric times till now, I suppose. The concept in business is you have to stay focused. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to be so narrowly focused that you miss opportunity. I think that's the key difference between the way some people read the book and the way others read the book is, you just have to be, what are you going to be the best at, right? That hedgehog was the best at protecting itself against prey, better than a fox, or against predators, rather, better than a fox. How are you going to be the best at what you do? For us, like I said, it's building systems to replace aging title and registration systems in government. How do we be the best at that? My view is serve that end consumer, not necessarily just the government. Like don't just suck from the government like so many entities that service the government do. Instead, think about the problem and solve the problem. And sometimes that leads to trying to solve a lot of things at once, which can again lead your team to maybe lose the right size aperture.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing. The more I speak to people, there's like no one knows anything. You know what I mean? Like there's your experience, and then there's mine, and then there's good to great, and the hedgehog principle, and the hedgehog principle means X to you, but Y to me, and Z to this other dude, or this other lady. And so I think the thing for me, it's about the perspective that you take and what you do with it. I think a lot of us are just we're prosumers. I call them not consumers, prosumers. We're just professional consumers of information now. And so much so that we negate the opportunity to actually put it into practice, and so it becomes lip service on a tweet. Like, just to circle back to something else you said about about how your vision hasn't really changed too much over since you started. You're like, we're going to go solve this problem, which is, by the way, a rarity, because I don't know, like everything I've scaled in my entrepreneurial journey changed radically. You know what I'm saying? Because this idea of pivoting, I spoke to Steve Blank, spent hours with him, and David Sconthal and many other theoretical, also obviously built big businesses, but they're like classical lean startup stuff. It's about innovating towards the customer problem, and the mom test, and there's all these books and the lean startup method and whatever by Eric Ries. and 4 steps to the epiphany. And it's this doctrine, right, of how you scale a startup. And it is about evolving and changing to get to a place where you're at product market fit and then you can scale. But in that process, you wind up in many cases having a business that you didn't anticipate you would ever have, right? But the idea is that there's no silver bullet. You just keep shooting lead until something sticks.
Well, I think you bring up a really good point, and I see it, if you look at sort of any conflict, with a partner, a spouse, a colleague, whomever, oftentimes there isn't as much conflict. It's just that you've defined the terms slightly differently. And so what one person might call a pivot, another person might say, no, that was in the aperture I was looking at. We just weren't sure if we were on this side or that side. But it's not a pivot. We're just still in the aperture. We're still in the initial view. So I think some of it's definitional, right? Sometimes I think that when we define things, or when I define things, I'm trying to look through a really big aperture because my job is to see around corners. And what might be viewed as a pivot by one person is actually viewed by others as, no, this is in scope. It's just, we have to tweak it a little bit. And so your point about the hedgehog and people have different definitions of it. I think it holds for words like pivot as well. And oftentimes we find ourselves in a conflict, even though we're actually saying the same thing. And part of it's just the acknowledgement that, everyone's perspective is slightly different, right? It's like that old saying, there's 3 opinions to everything: your way, my way, and the right way. And so, maybe that's true.
I was watching Yellowstone. I don't know if you've watched that series.
Yeah, with a passion.
Yeah, dude, like we're on the final season. I was like addicted to that stuff. Amazing show. And in the show, Kevin Costner says, or John Dutton, he says, he's explaining, what was it? He's explaining like right or wrong. And he's like, there's no right or wrong. You know what I mean? There's only the winner, where the loser has accepted the fact that he's lost.
Yeah. Well, truth be told, I was once on a trip and I had to order I was given the opportunity to order a cowboy hat. And so I was like, oh, I won't get to do this too often. So they said, well, what do you want it to look like? I said, I want the full Rip experience. Give me exactly what Rip wears in Yellowstone. So there's some great characters that come out of there, but also some interesting, stories about how did you scale a ranch in the 1800s, 1900s, and 2000s, right? And so there's a lot of truth to some of those stories when you dig in behind the drama.
And parallels also, because I would say that the fact that you reach scale, someone's always trying to come and take your ranch from you. Which is the whole premise for the whole show. Really, is like this massive ranch in Montana, or Montana, to better say it, Montana. That would be a different state. We should do it together, Shane. But it's like they're at the scale thing, and someone's coming to take it from you.
Yeah. And so the key I've learned is everybody needs a Beth Dutton in their life to protect them.
Oh my God, I love that character.
Yep. Yeah. Thankfully, my wife is my Beth Dutton. I'm delighted that she protects me from all the stupid things I might otherwise try.
Yeah, exactly. If you're a male entrepreneur and you don't know what to do, consult a woman, not your mother, because she'll just tell you it's a good thing. You're okay, Sonny. But let's wrap this up, Shane. I want to have a bit of fun with you, and then we'll let you go. If you could get into the Map Round Show time machine and go back to yourself on day one, and think about all the things you failed at, succeeded at, etc., in the context of scale, what advice would you give yourself on day one?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's keep shaking that sifter to find the right partners as early as possible, right? There's the occasions where I look back and thought we were probably putting perfect in front of good enough. And at the same time, we were probably not shaking that sifter as harshly as we should have been to really identify all the right partners, because there were some mistakes where we spent time in the wrong places. But I think we've started to figure out the right cadence of not putting perfect in front of good enough, and shaking that sifter of partners, because you really do need the right partners to scale a business.
That idea, by the way, is really powerful, Hem, that it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be good enough. And I think if we just did more of that, how much time and headache and frustration that would take away from most of our journeys. Because I'm a perfectionist by nature. Like, creatively, it's like everything must be done right. Like if there's a line off, like, hey, but like it's good enough, dude. No one's gonna give a shit about your line.
Yeah, that's very true. It's like that parking spot. I'd rather get the pole position and have my car parked crooked than wait and lose the spot to somebody else because I was trying to line it up perfectly.
There you go. Shane, it's been a privilege having you here. Thanks, everybody. We'll speak to you all again soon. Cheers.
Thank you, man.